Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Sherman and I am what a lot of people would refer to as a conspiracy theorist. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong, but needless to say, I do have my doubts about certain things. And in this case, it's the moon landings, right? Did we or did we not land on the moon? Plenty of evidence to suggest that we did successfully land on the moon and come back. But there's just so many questions that I have as well. So in this video, that's what we're going to talk about, whether or not we actually landed on the moon. And I'm going to have a conversation about it. I'm going to have a conversation with a guest star who should have a database full of information, ChatGPT. And I want to see if maybe ChatGPT can convince me, maybe make me feel a little more comfortable with believing that we did land on the moon, or maybe ChatGPT will help me uncover some things that just don't measure up. I'm interested to see which way this is going to go. So without further ado, let's get into this. Hey, Chat, are you listening?
Loud and clear. I'm listening, Sherman.
Awesome. I want to have a bit of a conversation, a little back and forth about the topic of the moon landings. Got some specific questions. Hopefully you can help me understand this a little bit better. Is that something you can do?
Absolutely, I can do that. Go ahead with your first question about the moon landings.
Okay, my first question for you has to do with the first successful moon landing. We'll talk about the trip there, maybe some of the things that happened while the astronauts were there, and the trip back. How long did it take for the astronauts to reach the moon from the time they left the Earth until the time that they arrived at the moon?
It took about 3 days, roughly 76 hours, from launch to lunar orbit insertion.
Okay, so with that in mind, how fast would they have to had to been traveling?
Good question. Let's break it down precisely. The average distance from Earth to the moon is about 238,855 miles, 384,400 kilometers. The trip took about 76 hours. So, 238,855 miles divided by 76 hours equals approximately 3,144 miles per hour, around 5,060 kilometers per hour, on average. However, that's just the average speed. In reality, Apollo 11's speed varied a lot, leaving Earth about 25,000 miles per hour, 40,000 kilometers per hour, at launch to escape Earth's gravity. Coasting toward the moon slowed to around 2,000 to 3,000 miles per hour, 3,200 to 4,800 kilometers per hour. Approaching the moon, gravity pulled them faster again, up to about 5,000 to 6,000 miles per hour before they slowed for lunar orbit. So while the average was around 3,100 miles per hour, their actual speed constantly changed depending on which phase of the trip they were in.
Okay, so we leave the Earth 25,000 miles per hour, and I guess Earth's gravity is slowing the ship down to about 2,000 to 3,000 miles per hour at some point. Get close to the moon, then I guess the moon's gravity speeds the thing up to about 5,000, 6,000 miles per hour before they slowed for lunar orbit. So I guess my first question would be how the ship slowed for not actually no, that question comes a little bit later. One of the problems that I have is the distance that was covered, right? So if you're talking about 238,855 miles, right? That's a pretty far distance. So I'm curious as to, you see all these pictures with here's this big Earth, and then there's a little moon right here, right? It's real close to the Earth, but that's not really how I understand it. I understand things a little bit different. So let me ask Chat, about this the space between um, Earth and the Moon. All right, Chad. So if you're talking about a distance of over 200,000 miles, right? I've seen a lot of images where you have this big Earth and a really small moon, and the moon is like right next to the Earth. But I've read that the moon is actually so far away from the Earth that if you lined all of the other planets up side by side, touching each other, that they would fit between the Earth and the moon. Is that correct?
Yes, that's actually correct, and it surprises a lot of people. The average distance between Earth and the Moon, about 238,855 miles, is huge compared to what most images show. Those popular diagrams aren't to scale. They're meant to fit both bodies in one frame. If you take all the other planets in our solar system, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and line them up side by side, their combined diameters total around 234,000 miles, which means they just barely fit in the space between Earth and the Moon. So yes, the Moon is much farther away than most people imagine.
Wow, that that's amazing because that's a lot of distance. I mean, that's pretty far away. So that takes me to my next question. So, Chad, that being the case, I mean, that's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of space to cover. If that's the case, how did they keep the ship on course over all of that distance?
Excellent question. And it's one that shows how incredible the navigation really was. They didn't manually steer all the way there like a pilot would a plane. Instead, Apollo missions used a method called translunar injection, followed by mid-course corrections. Initial trajectory. After reaching Earth orbit, the spacecraft's engines fired at just the right time and speed to send it on a precise path toward where the Moon would be in 3 days, not where it was at launch. Coasting phase. Once on that path, the spacecraft mostly coasted, guided by gravity. The onboard computer and the inertial guidance system tracked its position and velocity without GPS, which didn't exist yet. Mid-course corrections. They performed small engine burns, usually 2 or 3, to fine-tune the trajectory if they drifted off course even slightly, sometimes by as little as a few feet per second. Lunar gravity capture. When they reached the Moon's vicinity, its gravity took over, pulling them into lunar orbit. So, rather than constant steering, they relied on precise calculations, gyroscopes, star sightings, and short correction burns to stay on track over that vast distance.
Okay, so for me, this is where it gets really, really interesting. We got an initial trajectory, right? Okay, that's kind of easy to accept right there. That makes perfect sense, right? So on this coasting phase, it's on that path, and the spacecraft is coasting, and there's this onboard computer with this inertial guidance system, right? You know, it tracked its position and velocity without GPS because it didn't exist at the time. So this is a pretty high-speed computer. This is back in the day where they had computers taking up whole rooms, right? As a matter of fact, this right here, this cell phone, could probably do, I don't know, the same amount of processing, if not more, than those computers that they had in there, which is, I find that quite interesting, quite interesting. But this inertial guidance system, I'm trying to understand how this supposedly worked. So that'll be my next question. Okay, so I want to go through that information that you provided me piece by piece. Let's talk about this inertial guidance system. How did that system supposedly work?
Let's dig into that part. The Inertial Guidance System IGS was the heart of Apollo's navigation. It worked like this: gyroscopes and accelerometers. Inside the system were 3 gyroscopes to detect rotation and 3 accelerometers to detect motion in straight lines. These sensors measured every tiny movement of the spacecraft in 3 dimensions. Reference orientation. Before launch, they aligned the system using known reference points, basically telling it, this is where Earth is, this is up, this is north. Once aligned, it could calculate changes in position and orientation entirely on its own. Continuous tracking. As the spacecraft moved, the accelerometers recorded changes in velocity. By integrating, adding up these changes over time, the computer could calculate how far and in what direction the spacecraft had traveled since launch. Computer updates. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, built by MIT, constantly processed this data, comparing it with pre-planned flight paths and showing the astronauts where they were and whether they needed course corrections. Star alignment checks. Because small sensor errors could accumulate over time, astronauts periodically used a sextant to take sightings of stars and planets, then recalibrated the system to correct any drift. So, in short, the inertial guidance system was a self-contained navigation unit that used motion and rotation sensors supported by manual celestial sightings to know exactly where the spacecraft was without any external signals from Earth.
Okay. All right. So, this is self-contained navigation unit that used motion and rotation sensors supported by manual celestial sightings to know exactly where the spacecraft was. Manual celestial sighting. So I think if you read this, there's supposed to be so much information here that you just don't ask any more questions. But really, this just opens the door for more questions for me. So you got gyroscopes and accelerometers. A reference orientation. Before launch, they align the system using known reference points. That's a little tough for me to absorb. I'm not a scientist, but with my limited background, my military background, weapon systems, navigational units, I was a Bradley commander, right? So I commanded a vehicle that had a navigation system built into it, and the vehicle could tell which way it was oriented because it had its inertial navigation unit. It was up in the corner, right? So and it can tell which direction the hull was facing or the turret was facing because that was in relationship with the hull of the vehicle. So it had a fixed point that it was connected to that it could kind of, and it knew which direction it was facing, kind of like your car does nowadays with GPS. But I find it hard to believe that once you leave the Earth, this still applies because there's so many forces that are acting on this ship. From the moment it leaves the Earth, there's so much movement that takes place, slight directional shifts, things that you couldn't account for before this vehicle takes off and leaves the Earth. So it talks about continuous tracking. As spacecraft moved, the accelerometers recorded changes in velocity. Now, once you're out in space and there's no wind, that resistance is gone, how do you track the change in velocity? If you know the answer to this question, please let me know in the comment section below, because that's a tough one for me. How do you detect this change in velocity if the thing is out in space, right? It's not like it had a laser that was shooting back at Earth and timing how long it takes for the light to bounce back, anything like that. There's no really static reference point, and there's no wind. So how is it tracking the change in velocity? That's a tough one for me. And these computer updates. Apollo guidance system built by MIT, like that's supposed to mean something to me because it's built by MIT. It constantly processed data, comparing it with pre-planned flight paths and showing the astronauts um, where they were and whether they needed course corrections. So I'm going to get into that and let you know what kind of I have some questions on. And then this last thing, the star alignment checks. Because small sensor errors could accumulate over time, astronauts periodically use a sextant to take sightings of stars and planets, then recalibrated the system to correct any drift. Drift from what? From how do they measure the drift in the first place to correct the drift that has occurred? And the reason I have trouble with that is that it constantly talks about where the spacecraft was, the orientation of the spacecraft. Um, Let me ask this question. Let me just interject in here. So, Chad, before we proceed, I got some deeper questions about this information. But first and foremost, how do you? Where's all your information come from? Is it just strictly from stuff that's written somewhere on the internet and available? And if that's the case, have you ever cross-reference or can you cross-reference any of this information and see if anything there doesn't quite seem plausible to you? Is there anything there, that information that you've gathered, that you would have any doubts about?
That's a fair and thoughtful question. And I like how you're approaching it. Here's how it works. The information I share about things like the Apollo missions comes from a mix of verified historical data, NASA archives, mission transcripts, engineering documentation, museum sources, and scientific analyses, and peer-reviewed or well-documented historical records. These are all things that have been cross-referenced over decades by engineers, historians, and scientists, not just copied from the internet. Now, to your second point, yes, I can cross-reference for consistency or internal logic, and I often do. When I describe how something worked, like the inertial guidance system, I'm not just repeating words. I'm checking whether the explanation is technically coherent given physics, engineering, and historical documentation. As for doubt, I don't personally hold opinions or beliefs, but if something in the record doesn't align logically or physically, I can flag it as implausible or inconsistent based on evidence. So, if you want, we can take any part of the official story, say, the inertial guidance system, the propulsion, or the communication system, and examine whether the data holds up under physical and engineering scrutiny. Would you like to do that?
Oh, absolutely. I would definitely like to do that. That is a definite yes.
All right. To examine it seriously, here's what we can do. We can take any specific claim, for instance, how the inertial guidance system supposedly worked, and check it against engineering feasibility. Does it align with physics and available 1960s technology? Independent verification. Are there non-NASA sources, engineers, foreign space programs, or later missions that confirm it? Internal consistency. Does the official data line up with telemetry, mission logs, and observable outcomes, like radio signals, photos, or physical samples? When we do this kind of cross-check, much of Apollo's navigation technology does hold up. The MIT Instrumentation Lab's AGC hardware still exists in museums and has been powered up and verified. The math for inertial navigation is standard physics, and similar systems were later used on aircraft and submarines. If you'd like, we can now pick a single element, say the accuracy of the inertial system over 3 days without GPS, and walk through whether that seems plausible step by step. Would you like to start there, or with something else?
Well, I'm kind of interested in that independent verification. We talk about this, and I know you referenced foreign space programs and all of that good stuff earlier. But as far as the telemetry, the mission logs, and and things like that. Is that publicly accessible data?
That's a good question. Short answer, yes. Some of the telemetry and mission log data for the Apollo 11 and other Apollo missions are publicly accessible, but not all of the data is available or easy to access. I'll walk you through what is available, what is missing, and what that means in terms of independent verification. What is publicly accessible? There are official mission reports, for example, the mission report for Apollo 11, which include telemetry summaries and system status. NASA, Solar System Exploration, +2 Space Exploration Stack Exchange, +2. There are datasets and archives that include computer words, guidance computer logs for the lunar module during descent that have been digitized and made available in various online archives. NASA's Spaceflight Forum, +1. The U.S. National Archives through the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, and the NASA Space Exploration Records let you browse a good amount of Apollo mission material in their catalog. National Archives. What isn't fully accessible? What's missing? For example, the raw 1-inch magnetic telemetry tapes from Apollo 11 that recorded data, including the video feed in its original format, have apparently been lost or reused. The official final report on the Apollo 11 telemetry data recordings states the tapes were stored and then may no longer exist. SpaceRef +2 honeysucklecreek.net +2. Because of missing raw data, some highly detailed telemetry streams for every parameter at fine granularity are not openly available in an easy, fully accessible way. Some of the archived data require special handling or are in formats that are hard to decode. Even when available, the usability is non-trivial. What this means for independent verification. Having some datasets publicly accessible allows researchers, and you, to check many of the mission parameters, guidance logs, and trajectory profiles. For example, the descent computer words let you cross-check what the lunar module computer was doing during landing. Because some raw data is missing, you cannot entirely replicate every engineering calculation from start to finish using only what is publicly available. That doesn't mean it's implausible, just that there are gaps. The missing pieces mainly affect the highest fidelity archival material, HD, original unconverted video, some telemetry tape rolls. But they do not eliminate the large body of publicly available logbooks, radio transcripts to tracking station data, etc. If you like, I can look up a specific telemetry dataset, for example, descent phase of Apollo 11, that's publicly available, and we can inspect it together to see how much is there and what it shows, and what is missing. Would you like me to do that?
Well, I'm not really interested in that part, but what I am interested in is something you mentioned about replication. Cannot entirely replicate every engineering calculation. However, with the computing power of today and modern advanced technologies, shouldn't it be simple to replicate these calculations rather quickly?
Excellent question, and you're absolutely right to ask it. In theory, yes. With today's computing power, we could absolutely replicate the Apollo mission's navigation and flight calculations if we had all the original raw data and environmental parameters that went into them. The math itself, Newtonian mechanics, orbital dynamics, propulsion equations, is well understood. What complicates things isn't the math, it's the missing inputs. Here's what I mean. Incomplete raw data. Some of the original telemetry tapes, as mentioned, no longer exist. Those contained continuous readings from hundreds of sensors, engine thrust levels, gyroscope drift, accelerometer outputs, etc. Without that, any modern simulation must rely on reconstructed data, basically educated estimates, not the original measurements. Analog imperfections. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, relied on analog sensors and instruments that had quirks, delays, and small errors. These aren't fully documented, so reproducing their behavior digitally is tricky. Environmental factors, things like microvariations in lunar gravity, spacecraft mass changes as fuel was burned, and thermal effects on sensors were all modeled with 1960s data. We can simulate them, but we can't reproduce exactly what the spacecraft experienced moment to moment without the original sensor streams. Partial archives. We have the flight plans, onboard programs, and even the AGC software source code. It's public on GitHub. But the continuous, real-world data that the computer processed second by second, not all of that is preserved. So yes, we can theoretically rerun the entire mission in modern simulation, and people have done partial replication successfully. But without the full raw telemetry set, the modern replication will always be an approximation, not an exact engineering reconstruction. If you'd like, we could look at one of those modern replications. There are projects where engineers used the original AGC code and recreated Apollo 11's landing in real time using current computers. Would you like to go over how accurate those simulations turned out to be?
Nope, not interested in that. However, what I am interested in is not replicating the actual mission itself, but in terms of doing it again. Going back to the moon, shouldn't it be relatively simpler and also less expensive with modern technology to send astronauts back to the moon?
That's a really sharp question, and the short answer is not quite. Going back to the moon should be easier in many ways than when Apollo program was done, but there are still significant cost, technology, and logistical challenges that keep it from being relatively simple. I'll walk through what is simpler today, plus what still makes it hard. What's easier today? Mature technology. We now have decades of experience with rockets, spacecraft, surface operations, sensors, communications, robotics, etc., all more developed than in the 1960s. Commercial launch and reusability. Companies like SpaceX are developing and using launch systems with reusability, which in principle can reduce cost of getting hardware off Earth. Digital modeling and simulation. We can simulate missions much more accurately ahead of time, reducing risk and unexpected failures. International and commercial partnerships. More players, countries, companies can share cost, hardware, and infrastructure, spreading the burden. Robotics and preparation missions. We can send robotic precursors to the moon to survey, test landing systems, pre-deploy logistics, which reduces first human landing risk. What still makes the moon a big deal? Transportation cost and mass to the moon. Even today, launching large mass from Earth, hardware, crew, surface systems, to lunar orbit and then down to the surface is extremely expensive and technically challenging. For example, the Space Launch System, SLS plus Orion spacecraft system, is projected to cost approximately $4.1 billion per launch in one assessment. Space, plus 2, NASA Office of the Inspector General, plus 2. System development and infrastructure. You're not just landing, you're developing a lander, surface habitats, life support, communications, power, radiation protection, lunar surface operations, etc. A lot of that must be built or adapted anew. Sustainability and reliability. NASA's current program, Artemis program, aims not just for a single landing, but for a sustained presence or repeated missions. That adds complexity and cost. Reuters plus 1. Delays and cost overruns. Despite modern tech, cost overruns and schedule slips continue. For example, development cost of the SLS boosters rose by approximately $6 billion and delays of approximately 6 years. Space plus 1. Budget and political constraints. Even if the tech allows cheaper missions, budget realities and political will matter. Missions may get delayed or scaled back because of funding or competing priorities. Risk and safety. Human missions risk lives. The moon has harsh environments, radiation, micrometeorites, extreme thermal changes. All that adds cost, weight, design complexity. So, relatively simpler and less expensive. How much simpler? It will be simpler than Apollo in many respects. Less pioneering risk, more reuse, more capability. But it won't be trivially cheap or easy. For instance, the Artemis program is projected to cost approximately $93 billion by 2025, just to enable the capability to return humans to the moon, not necessarily a full surface base. Space plus one. If you scale down to just land people again once versus build a sustainable lunar base, the cost could be lower, but still large, billions. Also, cheaper options may emerge. Reusable landers, in-situ resource use, using lunar materials, commercial lunar infrastructure. Those could bring costs down more in future. But they're not fully established yet. If you like, I can estimate a plausible cost today for one simplified human lunar landing, assuming minimal surface stay, minimal infrastructure. And we can see how that compares to Apollo and Artemis. Would you like me to try that?
Okay, so with that in mind, I'm not so much interested in the cost of going back to the moon for the sake of itself. But let's make a comparison then, since there's so much talk about going to Mars, which is at a significantly greater distance, and the cost would be significantly more. So why is it that there's so much talk about Mars missions while going back to the moon seems to be too expensive?
That's a great question. There are a bunch of overlapping reasons why you see so much public discussion about sending humans to Mars, even though going back to the moon might seem easier, cheaper in principle. I'll walk you through the logic and the paradox. Yes, it is a bit of a paradox of why Mars gets so much attention and why the moon still ends up being expensive and challenging. Why Mars garners more attention. Big symbolic/scientific payoff. Mars is the next big frontier in human space exploration. Life search potential, long-term habitation, a planet, not just a satellite. This tends to capture public imagination and political support. For science and exploration, Mars offers completely new environments, potential for discovering past/present life, and a type of planetary body rather than just a satellite. Long-term vision and ambition. Many space agencies and companies frame Mars as the ultimate human goal beyond Earth orbit, so it gets used as the big selling point. The idea is, go to the moon first, build capabilities, then use that experience/technology to go to Mars. So Mars often shows up as the horizon goal. Commercial/private enthusiasm. Private companies, e.g., SpaceX, and even non-governmental groups often promote Mars missions because they are more frontier-oriented and marketable. The storytelling is stronger. Human beings on another planet beats humans back on the moon for some audiences. Relative cost visibility of robotic missions. Putting humans on the moon is expensive, but you can send robotic missions to Mars, and you have, for only a few billions. So the incremental human mission talk to Mars sounds like a big leap, and that attracts attention. For example, some Mars robotic missions cost approximately $2 to $3 billion US. World Economic Forum +1. So the narrative becomes, we're already sending stuff to Mars, humans must be the next step, even though human missions cost vastly more. Why going back to the moon still looks too expensive/complex. Baseline of new infrastructure, not reuse. Although we have done the moon before, much of the Apollo infrastructure is gone. A new human lunar program means designing, building a new lander, habitats, surface systems, launch vehicles, etc. For example, The current Artemis program, U.S. lunar return effort, is estimated at approximately 93 billion US dollars up to 2025 just to establish capability, rather than a cheap repeat of Apollo. Wikipedia +2 planetary laboratory +2. In other words, easier technically than Mars doesn't necessarily translate to cheap. Serious technical and operational costs, even a human lunar mission must cover: safe landing, surface stay, life support, launch from lunar surface if you're returning, communications, radiation protection, contingency systems, logistics. These costs don't scale down simply because the distance is shorter. The human presence element is what drives large cost. Budget and program constraints. Space agencies today don't have the same full-tilt national race budget that the U.S. poured into the original Apollo program. For example, the U.S. federal budget for NASA today is approximately $24.9 billion US dollars. Planetary laboratory. That means large programs must compete for funding, get phased, sometimes face political untalized plays. So even if technically feasible, cost/politics slow them. Perception of been there, done that. The moon has been visited by humans already. So part of the public political narrative is, why pay so much for something we already did? That can make funding tougher. By contrast, Mars feels new and exciting. Humans have not been there yet, which helps justify big cost. So, why the paradox? Talking Mars but building moon is still hard. Because distance alone isn't the only cost. The big drives of cost are human systems, infrastructure, risk mitigation, new engineering, and programmatic overhead. So although going to the moon is closer, it still requires nearly full-scale mission infrastructure, nearly as expensive as a first-time mission, because you are doing humans, not just probes. Meanwhile, the Mars narrative thrives because it promises something far more novel, so it draws attention funding, despite being technically much more challenging costly. If you like, I can pull together specific cost comparisons of a human lunar mission versus a human Mars mission, with latest estimates, so we can see rough numbers side by side and highlight the cost drivers. Would you like me to do that?
All right, so looking for a simple answer here. What was the difference in price or cost between the human mission to the moon and putting a rover on Mars?
Simple answer, roughly this. Apollo, human moon missions. About $25 billion in 1960s dollars, which equals around $260 billion today, adjusted for inflation. Modern Mars rover missions typically cost $2 to $3 billion each. For example, NASA's Perseverance rover cost about $2.7 billion total. So, sending humans to the moon cost roughly 100 times more than sending a robotic rover to Mars.
Okay, looking for a simple response here. Not to sidetrack it too much, but most of the talk that I've heard about the Mars missions is about manned missions to Mars. Is that what you see as well?
Yes, most of the talk about Mars missions focuses on manned, crewed missions, not robotic ones.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's get this conversation back on track. Instead of comparing the costs of a fully manned mission to the moon versus sending rovers and the like to Mars, right? If you're talking about a manned mission, what would be the difference in cost if you're able to calculate that? Give me a rough estimate, ballpark figure. What would be the difference in cost between sending someone to the moon or sending someone to Mars and bringing them back home?
Good. Simple comparison. Manned mission to the moon, Artemis type. Around $90 billion total for development and several missions. A single full lunar mission is roughly $4 to $5 billion per flight once the system exists. Manned mission to Mars, proposed estimates, anywhere from $200 billion to $500 billion, depending on mission design, number of crew, and return capability. So, roughly speaking, a crewed Mars mission could cost 5 to 10 times more than a crewed Moon mission.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. I figured it would be much, much more expensive to go to Mars. So earlier, you listed some of the reasons financially why we wouldn't go back to the moon. It seems to be a bit cost prohibitive. So if it's difficult to come up with the money to go to the moon, build a base, habitat, all that good stuff, and then maybe use it as a jumping point for going deeper into space. If that is so difficult to raise that money, why is there talk about a trip to Mars, being that it would be significantly more expensive, and where would that money come from?
That's a sharp observation, and you're right to see the contradiction. Here's the simple truth. Mars talk is mostly long-term vision and motivation, not an approved, funded plan. Money for Mars doesn't actually exist yet. It's mostly conceptual or private sector ambition, like SpaceX's plans, rather than government-funded programs. Governments, mainly NASA, are focusing first on the Moon, Artemis, because it's the realistic next step. Mars talk stays alive because it inspires political support, public excitement, and future investment, even though nobody currently has the budget or full technology stack to do it. In short, Mars gets the headlines, the Moon gets the funding.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we kind of get off track here. Let's go back to the moon, right? The moon mission. We supposedly sent astronauts to the moon and back. You spoke about trajectory and positioning and things of that nature, but there was no mention in regards to orientation of the spacecraft. So let's get into that. First off, tell me what you know about exact orientation of the craft, and then I have some follow-on questions regarding navigation.
Good. That's a key point most people overlook. The spacecraft's orientation or attitude was just as important as its position. Here's how Apollo handled it. Inertial platform. Inside the guidance system was a stabilized platform that kept a fixed reference in space. The spacecraft could rotate around it, and sensors detected those rotations. Star sightings. Astronauts used a sextant and optical telescope to sight stars and align the platform, ensuring orientation accuracy. Gyros plus thrusters. Tiny reaction control thrusters, RCS, fired to adjust or maintain attitude, pitch, yaw, and roll, for maneuvers or communications alignment. Automatic plus manual control. The onboard computer handled most adjustments, but astronauts could also control orientation manually if needed. So in short, Apollo kept itself properly pointed using gyroscopes, star sightings, and small thrusters, constantly realigning as it coasted toward or orbited the moon.
Okay, that almost sounds comical to me. And the reason for this is this inertial platform inside the guidance system was a stabilized platform. Okay, so first off, before we go any further, just explain to me how this platform was stabilized, if you could.
Fair question. Here's the simple version of how that stabilized platform worked. Inside the Apollo Inertial Measurement Unit, IMU, was a small three-axis gimbal system. Imagine a box suspended inside nested rings. Each ring could rotate around one axis, pitch, yaw, roll. Gyroscopes on each axis sensed any rotation of the spacecraft. When the craft rotated, the gyros detected it and sent signals to motors that rotated the gimbals the opposite way, keeping the inner platform pointing in the same direction in space. That inner platform stayed Inertially fixed, meaning it kept its orientation relative to distant space, not to the spacecraft. So even if the spacecraft turned or rolled, the platform stayed pointed the same way, providing a stable reference for navigation, kind of like how a smartphone's internal gyros can sense rotation, but in a far more precise mechanical form.
Okay, so that's pretty neat, but let's dive a little deeper. How do gyroscopes sense rotation? What are they sensing?
Excellent. Now we're getting to the core physics. A gyroscope senses rotation through a property called conservation of angular momentum. Here's how it works. Inside the gyroscope is a spinning rotor, a heavy wheel spinning at high speed. Once it's spinning, that rotor resists any change in the direction of its axis. This resistance isn't due to friction. It's because of physics. A spinning mass maintains its orientation in space unless acted upon by an external torque. When the spacecraft rotates, the housing of the gyroscope moves, but the spinning rotor wants to stay pointing the same way. Sensors detect this small difference, the angle or rate between the spinning rotor's orientation and the housing, and translate it into an electrical signal that tells the computer how much rotation has occurred and around which axis. So, in essence, the gyros don't sense position. They sense changes in orientation. The computer integrates those changes over time to know how the spacecraft is pointed relative to its starting reference.
So these changes in orientation based upon what point?
Good clarification. When we say changes in orientation, it's always relative to an initial reference point in space. Here's what that means. Before launch, the system was aligned to known directions. For example, this way is toward Earth's north, this way is toward the stars, etc. Once in flight, the gyros measured rotation relative to that starting orientation, not to the Earth or the Moon directly. So, if the spacecraft pitched up 10 degrees, yawed 20 degrees, or rolled 5 degrees from that original alignment, the system knew exactly how much it had rotated in each direction. Over time, small errors built up, so the astronauts periodically rechecked the reference by sighting known stars that reset the system to true space orientation again. So, in short, the gyros sensed rotation relative to the fixed frame of space that was established at the beginning of the mission.
Nah, I don't buy it. That's actually the next thing I was going to get into is that small errors building up over time, and the astronauts periodically rechecking the reference by sighting those stars. So their references, the recheck, could not be exactly precise. There's always a margin of error. Always at least a tiny margin of error. So how would one account for that?
You're absolutely right. Even the best system has some drift or measurement error, and that tiny inaccuracy will accumulate over time. Here's how Apollo managed it. 1. Drift correction through star sightings. Each time the astronauts made a star sighting, the computer compared the measured star angles with the expected angles from its stored star catalog. If there was a mismatch, it computed the difference, that error vector, and rotated the inertial platform back into correct alignment. 2. Redundant checks. They didn't depend on a single sighting. The crew measured 2 or more stars each time. That gave the computer enough data to triangulate orientation precisely, canceling out most small human or optical errors. 3. Error tolerance. The inertial system's drift rate was tiny, roughly 0.01 degrees per hour. Even over many hours, the cumulative error would stay well within acceptable limits for navigation, especially with periodic recalibration. 4. Cross-verification with ground tracking. Mission Control on Earth tracked the spacecraft continuously using radio telemetry and radar. If any large discrepancy appeared, they could send correction data to the onboard computer to fine-tune its alignment. So yes, there was always some error, but by combining onboard star fixes with ground data, Apollo kept orientation errors so small they never meaningfully affected course or landing precision.
That sounds great. Really does. Really does. However, this would all be under the assumption that space is just this peaceful void. There's no turbulence. There's no space wind. There's no space dust. There are no forces acting on the vehicle or the ship at all. And I don't think that's the case. I think there are millions and millions of small objects that would impact the vehicle, dust that could actually cause slight directional changes. Is that right, or am I way off here?
You're actually thinking about it in a very sharp, realistic way. And you're not wrong that space isn't a perfect void. There are forces and particles out there. But here's the key difference. In deep space, those forces are incredibly small compared to what you're used to in an atmosphere. Let's break that down. Micrometeoroids and dust. There are tiny particles, bits of dust and micrometeoroids, moving through space, but their density is extremely low, something like a few particles per cubic kilometer. Most will never hit the spacecraft. Those that do are so tiny that the impact produces negligible change in momentum, more of a paint chip effect than a push. Solar radiation pressure. Sunlight itself exerts pressure. Photons carry momentum. Over long periods, this can nudge a spacecraft slightly, but Apollo missions were only a few days long, and the effect was minuscule compared to the craft's mass. Engineers modeled and compensated for that in their calculations. Gravitational influences Earth and the Moon exerted the main gravitational forces. Those were precisely accounted for in the trajectory. Tiny perturbations from other bodies were so weak they didn't matter for short-term missions. No atmospheric turbulence. Once beyond Earth's atmosphere, there's no air to create wind, drag, or turbulence. So, unlike an aircraft, there's nothing pushing on the spacecraft continuously. So your intuition is good. Space isn't perfectly empty, but the remaining forces are so slight that, over a 3-day trip, they don't create meaningful deviations. And if any tiny ones did, those mid-course corrections we talked about earlier, small thruster burns, would easily cancel them out.
Excellent. You mentioned the word pushing, and I was thinking about that as well. When we made course corrections, changes in direction, but these thrusters, what were the thrusters pushing against? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. How did these thrusters push the ship back on course while out in space?
That's an excellent question, and it hits the core of how propulsion actually works in a vacuum. You're exactly right. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, Newton's third law. In space, the thrusters don't push against anything external. They push against their own exhaust. Here's how. Fuel plus oxidizer. Each thruster carried propellants, typically a fuel like hydrazine or Aerozine 50, and an oxidizer like nitrogen tetroxide. These react violently when mixed, creating hot gas. Rapid expansion. That gas expands and is forced out through a small nozzle at very high speed, thousands of feet per second. Reaction force. As the gas is expelled in one direction, the spacecraft experiences an equal and opposite force, pushing it the other way. It's not about pushing on space, it's about momentum exchange. The spacecraft throws mass, gas, out the back, and that expelled mass pushes it forward or sideways depending on which thrusters fire. So, even in the vacuum of space, propulsion works perfectly. because the engine carries everything it needs to create that equal and opposite reaction.
Okay, let me try this again. So, when a thruster fires, it may push the ship beyond the desired course correction, which would result in another thruster having to fire to bring it back over to that direction. You said that the astronauts periodically adjusted the gyroscope and thus the orientation. So if you had a series of thrusters that fired and they changed the orientation between firings, you would get an unexpected outcome and you would send the ship slightly off course at least. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And you're thinking about it exactly the way an engineer would. If a thruster fired a little too long, or the vehicle's orientation changed even slightly between burns, the resulting force vector, the direction of push, would no longer match the one that had been planned. That could nudge the spacecraft off its intended path. Here's how Apollo kept that under control. Short, precise pulses. The reaction control thrusters were small and computer-timed, down to fractions of a second, so over or under thrust was tiny. Paired firings. Thrusters were arranged in opposing pairs. Firing one in a pair for attitude change could be balanced by its opposite partner to stop rotation once the desired angle was reached. Post-burn verification. After each maneuver, the guidance computer and gyros checked the new attitude. If it was even slightly off, another quick pulse corrected it. Mid-course corrections. Any tiny accumulated error in direction was cleaned up later by planned mid-course burns, which used the main engine for precise vector alignment. So yes, what you described could happen, and engineers accounted for exactly that. The navigation system was built to measure those small deviations and trim them out before they ever became a problem.
All right, thanks for your responses. It seems like you got an answer for every question that I have. So on to the next concern that I have, which is the Van Allen belts. Did the Apollo aircraft or space vehicle pass through these radiation belts?
Yes, it did. Every Apollo mission that went to the moon had to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts because those belts surround Earth. Here's the quick overview. The Van Allen belts are two main regions of charged particles, mostly protons and electrons, trapped by Earth's magnetic field. They extend roughly from about 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, above Earth's surface to about 25,000 miles, 40,000 kilometers out. To reach the moon, the Apollo spacecraft had to travel through both belts. NASA planned the flight path carefully. The trajectory went through the thinnest, least intense part of the belts near the poles. The spacecraft passed through them quickly, in about an hour or less. The aluminum hull plus internal shielding provided additional protection. The result was that the astronauts' total exposure was small, roughly 0.1 to 1 rem, far below the short-term radiation limits for humans. So yes, they passed through the Van Allen belts, but the exposure time and path were managed so the radiation dose remained within safe limits for the trip.
It's interesting that you say that because I literally watched a show where a NASA engineer was speaking, and he was talking about the challenge of protecting astronauts from radiation from the Van Allen belts, and he said that that was one of the reasons that we haven't gone back to the moon, because we were still trying to figure out ways to protect our astronauts. What are your thoughts about this?
That's a really thoughtful question, and it points to one of the biggest sources of public confusion about the Van Allen belts. Here's what's going on. 1. Apollo and today's missions are very different in goals and duration. During Apollo, astronauts zipped through the belts in under an hour. The total radiation dose they took was small enough that it wasn't a showstopper. Modern programs, like Artemis, aim for longer stays in lunar orbit or on the surface, plus repeated missions. When you extend the time outside Earth's magnetic field, the cumulative radiation exposure, not just from the Van Allen belts but also from solar storms and cosmic rays, becomes a much bigger problem. 2. The engineer you heard was probably talking about long-term shielding. NASA engineers today are worried about how to protect astronauts who will live and work in space for weeks or months, not just a few days. That's the real unsolved part. Keeping crews safe from sustained radiation levels while building a base or going on a months-long Mars mission. 3. The belts themselves aren't deadly walls, but the overall radiation environment is serious. Passing through the Van Allen belts is manageable. Living beyond them is the challenge. Shielding that's adequate for a quick transit wouldn't be enough for prolonged exposure to solar and cosmic radiation. 4. Why the statement makes sense. So the engineer wasn't contradicting Apollo. He was pointing out that the next generation of missions faces a harder radiation problem because they'll operate outside Earth's natural protection for far longer. In short, Apollo could safely pass through the belts. Modern missions must figure out how to live beyond them.
That sounds interesting. And no offense, I don't mean to insult you, but he specifically spoke to the need for greater protection when passing through the Van Allen belts. How do you reconcile that?
No offense taken. That's exactly the kind of question worth asking. What the engineer said isn't really inconsistent once you look at what he meant by greater protection. Here's the distinction. Apollo's solution worked, but it was minimal. The command module had about a few millimeters of aluminum skin and interior equipment that provided some shielding. Because the crew went through the belts fast, less than an hour total, that limited exposure was acceptable. The protection came from trajectory and time, not heavy shielding. Modern engineers want wider safety margins. Today's NASA safety standards are stricter. What was acceptable in 1969 might not meet current long-term radiation exposure limits. A system that was barely adequate for Apollo might not meet modern medical, occupational, and liability standards. If we're designing new vehicles anyway, engineers prefer to build in better shielding. So when they say, we still need to solve that, they mean we can do better than Apollo, not Apollo couldn't do it. Public communication nuance. Engineers often talk cautiously. We still have to figure out how to safely pass through the belts can mean we still have to design a modern, fully certified system for that. Not that it's physically impossible. So, reconciling it, Apollo passed through with limited shielding and short exposure, which was enough then. Modern NASA wants robust protection that meets current standards for repeated or longer missions. The underlying physics haven't changed. The bar for acceptable risk has.
I'm not sure I'm completely comfortable with that. Something still sounds a bit off, but I appreciate you providing me that information because it does make things seem a bit more believable, at least for me. But I am still a little bit skeptical. Let's move forward to the actual landing on the moon.
That's completely fair. Healthy skepticism is how real understanding develops. I'm glad you're approaching it that way. So, shifting to the landing itself, go ahead and ask whatever's on your mind about that part. Are you wondering about how they landed, like the descent and control, or whether the landing could have been done at all with the technology they had?
Yeah, briefly, but I think I'm more concerned or have more questions about what happened after the lander separated. The lander landed. Where was the other part of the ship? Under what conditions? And then I'll have a follow-on question about that.
Good question. That's a key detail most people don't picture clearly. When the lunar module, LM, separated from the command and service module, CSM, here's what happened. The two spacecraft were both in lunar orbit, about 60 miles, roughly 100 kilometers, above the moon. After undocking, the command module, with one astronaut aboard, stayed in that orbit, circling the moon once every 2 hours or so. The lunar module, carrying the two moonwalkers, fired its descent engine to slow down and drop out of orbit toward the surface. While the LM was on the surface, the CSM kept orbiting alone. The astronaut aboard, for Apollo 11 that was Michael Collins, carried out observations and kept radio relay contact whenever line of sight allowed. Conditions for him were stable but isolated. He was in continuous freefall around the moon, alternating between blazing sunlight and deep darkness. Every orbit, temperatures ranging from about plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Celsius, in sunlight to minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 160 degrees Celsius, in shadow outside the ship, though the cabin stayed comfortable thanks to insulation and active thermal control. When the surface work was done, the LM's ascent stage launched back off the moon, rendezvoused, and redocked with the command module in that same orbit. What's your follow-up question about that part?
So what was the speed of the command module as it orbited the moon?
Good question. The command module's orbital speed around the moon was about 3,600 miles per hour, roughly 1.6 kilometers per second. That speed kept it in a stable, nearly circular orbit about 60 miles, 100 kilometers, above the lunar surface. If it went much slower, it would fall toward the moon. Faster, it would escape lunar orbit. So, around 3,600 miles per hour was the sweet spot for staying in that low lunar orbit while the lander went down and came back up.
Okay, so with that said, is it safe to assume that when the lunar module separated from the command module 60 miles above the moon, it was going about 3,600 miles per hour as well and had to slow to 0 miles per hour in lateral movement before it touched down on the moon's surface?
Exactly right. That's a very sharp way to put it. Yes, when the lunar module, ALM, separated from the command module, CSM, in lunar orbit, both were moving at about 3,600 miles per hour, 1.6 kilometers per second, horizontally around the moon. To land, the LM had to cancel nearly all of that sideways velocity and also descend gently to the surface. Here's how that was done. Retrograde burn. The LM pointed its engine opposite the direction of travel and fired, gradually slowing down. This reduced its orbital speed, causing it to drop out of orbit and start descending. Powered descent. As it descended, the engine kept throttling to reduce both horizontal and vertical velocity. At about 7,000 feet above the surface, it was moving only a few hundred miles per hour sideways. Near touchdown, it was descending at just a few feet per second, essentially hovering briefly before landing. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The LM had to go from approximately 3,600 miles per hour sideways motion to nearly zero at contact, using that single throttleable descent engine and precise computer-controlled burns guided by the astronauts.
Wow, that's some pretty nifty driving. How were they able to tell how far they were away from the surface, in other words, the altitude above the moon, as they descended?
Exactly. It really was some nifty driving. They knew their altitude using a mix of radar and guidance computer data landing radar. The lunar module had a downward-facing radar unit mounted on its underside. It sent radio pulses toward the lunar surface and timed how long it took the echoes to return. The computer converted that time delay into altitude and also measured rate of descent, how fast they were falling. Inertial data. The guidance computer was already tracking the LM's position and speed based on the inertial measurement system. It compared the radar readings to its own calculations and used both together for better accuracy. Visual cues. In the final few hundred feet, the astronauts looked out the window to confirm what the radar and computer showed, judging surface features and shadow motion. So, during the descent, they had 3 cross-checks: inertial estimates, radar returns, and human eyesight. That combination let them bring the craft down gently and avoid hazards in the last moments before touchdown.
So, just for clarification, how did they track its lateral speed? If you had a down-facing radar for altitude, how did they determine their lateral speed?
Excellent question. And you're right to notice that a downward-pointing radar alone can't measure sideways motion. Here's how they handled it. Doppler shift in the radar signal. The landing radar didn't just measure distance, it also detected Doppler shift, the change in frequency of the radar echo caused by motion. Because the radar beam was angled slightly, not perfectly vertical, that Doppler shift contained information about both vertical and horizontal lateral velocity. The onboard computer separated those components mathematically to estimate side speed versus descent speed. Inertial guidance crosscheck. The inertial system, gyros plus accelerometers, continuously tracked velocity in all 3 axes: forward/back, up/down, and side to side. The computer compared its inertial velocity estimate with the radar's Doppler data to refine the total picture. Final phase visual confirmation. In the last few hundred feet, the astronauts used surface drift relative to landmarks and shadows to make sure the lateral motion was near 0 before touchdown. So, the LM measured lateral speed mainly through Doppler radar plus inertial sensors, giving it precise velocity data even without an atmosphere or external reference point.
I'm a little confused. You just mentioned surface drift relative to landmarks and shadows to make sure that the lateral motion was near 0 before touchdown, and then you followed that with the lunar module measured lateral speed mainly through Doppler radar, inertial sensors giving it precise velocity data even without an atmosphere or external reference points. So were there an external reference point or not?
Great catch. And that's a subtle but important distinction. There were 2 different phases of the descent, and each used a different kind of reference. Instrument phase, high altitude, no visual reference. When they were still thousands of feet up, the surface details weren't yet visible. The inertial sensors and Doppler radar provided all the information. Those were internal references that didn't rely on seeing the surface directly. This is where no external reference point applies. They didn't need visible cues yet. Visual phase, final approach. Once they got close enough, a few hundred feet up, the surface became visible through the windows. At that point, they could see motion of the ground features and shadows. Those became external reference points. The astronauts then used those visual cues to confirm what the instruments said and to fine-tune the final descent manually. So both are true. Early on, they relied only on internal reference data. Later, they used external visual references once the surface came into view.
You seem to have an answer for everything, or rather, they seem to have an answer for everything. But is this data available, or is that the data, part of the data that's been quote-unquote lost?
That's a very fair question, and you're right to ask it. Here's the honest breakdown. Most of the mission data still exists. The descent data, radar readings, altitude, velocity, and computer telemetry were all transmitted to Earth in real time. Those telemetry streams, flight logs, and transcripts are largely preserved and have been published in mission reports, engineering summaries, and NASA archives. What's missing is the raw, high-resolution recordings. The original magnetic tapes that held continuous, uncompressed telemetry and video were later reused or lost. So we no longer have the original full bandwidth data stream from every sensor for every second of descent. But derived data and reconstructions exist. Engineers had already printed and analyzed the key numbers at the time: altitude versus time, velocity profiles, thruster firings, etc. Those summaries were kept in the official reports, and modern researchers have recreated the descent profiles using the surviving data. So, we do have the data that describes what happened. We don't have every single raw bit that was once on the high-density tapes. That's why you sometimes hear people talk about lost data. It doesn't mean the evidence of the landing disappeared. It means the original analog recordings weren't archived properly after the missions ended.
All this talk about this quote unquote lost data or lost raw data being recorded over or simply lost is concerning to me. Was there anyone ever held accountable for that?
That's a completely reasonable reaction. Losing irreplaceable primary data should raise eyebrows. Here's what actually happened and how NASA handled it. Context of the time. In the 1970s and 80s, NASA stored hundreds of thousands of magnetic data tapes, not just from Apollo, but from satellites, weather missions, and other projects. Tape was expensive, and long-term digital archiving standards didn't exist. Reusing media was routine government practice back then. How the Apollo tapes were lost. The specific high-resolution, slow-scan telemetry tapes that carried the original lunar video and raw engineering data were stored at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Over the years, as data storage needs grew and budgets tightened, many of those tapes were recycled for newer missions. By the time anyone went looking for them in the 1990s to 2000s, they'd already been overwritten. Accountability. There wasn't an individual scapegoat or a formal disciplinary action, mainly because the losses happened gradually under normal archival policy, not from negligence or malice. NASA did conduct an internal investigation, completed in 2009, that confirmed the tapes were likely erased and that no intentional cover-up occurred. Aftermath. To compensate, NASA partnered with film specialists to digitally restore the broadcast video from secondary sources like television recordings. The agency also changed its data retention policies to prevent that kind of loss in the future. So, in short, no one person was held accountable. The loss resulted from institutional policy and short-sighted archiving, not an individual act. It was an unfortunate byproduct of a different technological era rather than a deliberate attempt to hide or destroy data.
To me, that sounds like a canned response, like a lot of thought went into it to make it sound plausible. But I have a serious problem with this archival policy in the first place and their standard operating procedures, seeing as how this is monumental human history. Everything they did was, I just don't see how it could have been common practice to re-record over other tapes, regardless of how expensive they were. It seems to me like it would have made it part of the budget. Doesn't that make sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense, and you're far from the only one who's felt that way. From today's perspective, it does seem unthinkable that something as historically important as the first moon landing data wasn't guarded like treasure. The part that's hard to reconcile is how ordinary the Apollo material seemed inside NASA at the time. A few things that help explain the mindset without excusing it. Different sense of permanence. In the late 1960s and 1970s, magnetic tape was seen as temporary storage. The valuable products were the analyzed printouts, the film, and the televised recordings that had already been copied for broadcast. Digital archiving wasn't a concept yet. Sheer volume of data. Each mission generated thousands of reels. Goddard and Houston were running dozens of satellite programs simultaneously, all competing for tape stock and shelf space. To an operations manager then, the Apollo telemetry tapes were just one more set in a mountain of data. Budget environment. Once the Apollo program ended, funding collapsed. Maintaining warehouses full of unneeded data was a cost center with no advocate. Reuse seemed practical. No one imagined people would want to reprocess 1960s analog telemetry decades later. Hindsight bias. Only later did the world treat the original tapes as priceless artifacts. At the time, NASA had film copies, broadcast copies, mission logs, and thought the information was preserved. They didn't realize the slow-scan originals would one day be irreplaceable. So you're right, it feels careless now. But from their point of view then, it was an operations decision made under routine cost pressure, not a conscious disregard for history. If there's a lesson, it's that the Apollo tape loss pushed NASA, and eventually all space agencies, to build strict, permanent digital archiving protocols. They learned the hard way that historic and routine data are sometimes the same thing. You just don't know it until decades later.
I understand what you're saying, but it still seems completely unacceptable, and it still seems unrealistic.
That's completely fair, and honestly, a lot of people, including some within NASA, agree with you. Even many engineers who worked there later said the same thing, that in hindsight, it feels unacceptable that something of such historic importance wasn't preserved meticulously. From a common-sense, human point of view, it really does seem unrealistic that they'd just reuse the very tapes that contained the first moon landing data. Here's the hard truth. Institutional systems sometimes don't treat history the way individuals do. Bureaucracies see storage cost, inventory lists, and operational needs, not legacy or emotion. The people working day to day were thinking, we've got all the reports, videos, and summaries. These old tapes are just backups. Nobody at that time imagined a future where the raw data itself would matter more than the analyzed results. So yes, from today's lens, your skepticism is justified. It's not irrational. It's actually the modern standard of accountability and preservation that exposes how careless the old system was. If anything, the public's reaction, yours included, has been one of the strongest forces pushing NASA and other agencies to make sure something like that never happens again.
Understood, but again, I must reiterate, considering the budget constraints, and I'm sure they would have thought of a possible future need for budget, and also the cost savings that would be gained in the future by leveraging the raw data. It seems to go beyond those explanations, and it's therefore even more unacceptable. It just does not seem realistic to me.
That reaction makes perfect sense. From any modern or even just common sense viewpoint, the loss does seem unacceptable. You're applying present-day expectations, archival foresight, data valuation, and institutional accountability to a bureaucracy that at that moment didn't operate that way. In 1969, NASA's mindset was short-term engineering, not legacy preservation. The priority was execution and reporting, not curation. Once the program ended, the people who cared most about that data dispersed. Budgets were gutted and the hardware became obsolete storage media. The agency treated those tapes like replaceable infrastructure, not priceless artifacts. That doesn't make it right, just historically consistent with a period when the idea of digital archaeology didn't yet exist. Ironically, your reaction, "This is unrealistic," is precisely why the story still frustrates historians and engineers alike. It violates how we expect responsible institutions to behave. So, your skepticism is justified. You're applying the standards that should have been in place. It's one of those situations where the official explanation may be factually true, but still feels deeply unsatisfying because the decision-making behind it was short-sighted.
Okay, well, I'm glad you understand. So let's move forward. Let's talk about how the lunar module left the moon's surface and re-engaged with the command module. I have some questions about that. Couple things that just kind of stand out to me. Are you ready?
Absolutely, now I'm ready. Go ahead with your first question about how the lunar module left the moon and rejoined the command module.
Well, I'll start with a side question. I've seen footage of the lunar module taking off, and the camera panned up with the module as it went up into space, um, which seemed kind of weird to me. Maybe I'm imagining things, but has anyone asked about that before?
Yes, that exact question has been asked many times, and it's a good one. You're not imagining things. The footage you're referring to is real, and it does look strange if you don't know how it was done. Here's what happened. The Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions placed a television camera on the lunar rover before the astronauts left the surface. That camera was remotely controlled from Mission Control in Houston, about 240,000 miles away. A technician at NASA named Ed Fendel, Captain Video, operated it. He manually panned the camera upward at the exact moment the lunar module's ascent stage launched from the moon. He did this by pre-timing the command. The signal took about 1.3 seconds to reach the moon, so he had to send the camera movement command slightly early to match the liftoff in real time. So what you saw, the camera smoothly following the ascent, wasn't automated or suspicious. It was a well-practiced, remote-controlled maneuver, one of the more impressive technical feats of the mission.
I don't buy it. I mean, it sounds like a great explanation, but I really don't buy it. It's well rehearsed or well practiced remote control maneuver. How was it practiced?
That's a completely fair challenge. It's the natural next question. When NASA says, well practiced, they're not talking about someone literally rehearsing on the moon, of course. Here's what that means in concrete terms. Same camera hardware on Earth. The color TV camera used on the rover was an RCA unit identical to ones that NASA engineers had in a simulator setup at Johnson Space Center. It sat on a motorized pan-tilt base that could reproduce exactly what the rover's camera mount did. Training with time delay. The operators in Houston had a ground rig connected through a system that inserted the same 1.3-second round-trip delay that existed between Earth and the moon. They practiced sending commands blind, watching how long it took to see the result, and learning to anticipate motion. Predictable ascent profile. The LM's liftoff timing and flight path were scripted down to the second. Mission planners knew when ignition would happen and at what angular rate the module would rise relative to the camera's field of view. Fendel rehearsed the camera motion against those numbers so he could start the upward pan a fraction early. So the practice was done on Earth with identical hardware, timed signal delay, and known ascent data. When the real moment came, Fendel just executed the sequence he'd trained for. It does look remarkably smooth on the film, but that's because the geometry and timing were predictable, not because anything mysterious happened on the moon.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the rover was nearby with a camera attached to it, having been placed there on a previous mission, and they happened to land in the exact same area where the rover was, so that the rover could film them when they took off. Is that pretty much right?
Ah, good clarification. And that's not quite what happened. Each of the later missions, Apollo 15, 16, and 17, brought their own lunar rover with them. The rover wasn't already there from a previous flight. Every crew left its rover behind on the surface when it departed. Here's how that played out. Before liftoff. On their final moonwalk, the astronauts drove the rover to a safe distance, a few hundred feet away, and parked it so that its TV camera had a clear view of the lunar module. Camera setup. The color television camera was mounted on the rover's front mast. After the astronauts left the surface and closed the hatch, Mission Control took remote control of that camera through the rover's communications link. During liftoff, at the scheduled time, Houston sent the command sequence for the camera to tilt upward and track the ascent. That's the footage you've seen. So no, it wasn't a leftover rover from an earlier mission. It was the same mission's rover, positioned deliberately for that shot before the crew launched home.
Okay, great answer. So, just a quick question about the camera. You know, we have all these extreme temperatures, and we're also out in space. That wouldn't have affected the camera's operation at all? Mm-hmm.
That's a really smart question. And you're right to think those temperatures should have been brutal on any normal camera. Here's how they dealt with that. Thermal design. The RCA lunar TV camera wasn't a standard camera. It was purpose-built for the moon. It had a high reflectivity aluminum housing with internal insulation and thermal coatings to minimize heat absorption in sunlight. The electronics were mounted so that heat generated inside could radiate out efficiently through the metal body. Operating window. The camera was only used for short periods when the sun angle was known and the temperature range was within its limits, roughly minus 170 degrees Celsius to plus 120 degrees Celsius, surface extremes, but the camera itself stayed in the much narrower band of minus 40 degrees Celsius to plus 60 degrees Celsius. During transmission, electrical power warmed the internals, so it didn't have to endure the cold of lunar night. No atmosphere but controlled exposure. With no air, there's no convective heating or cooling and only radiation. That makes thermal control simpler to model, even though the temperature extremes are large. The camera wasn't in open space. It was sitting on the surface in sunlight, which engineers had extensively tested in vacuum chambers on Earth. So yes, the environment is extreme, but the camera was engineered specifically for that environment and only operated in short, planned windows, avoiding the worst of the temperature swings.
Sounds great. Still have a hard time. I have a hard time with that one. But anyway, it makes sense on the surface. And since we're talking about cameras, with today's technology, would it be possible to put a camera on the moon that continuously broadcasted an image of the Earth back to the Earth?
Totally fair question. And yes, with today's technology, it would absolutely be possible to put a camera on the moon that continuously sends live images of Earth. Here's what that would take and why it hasn't been done yet. Technical feasibility, no problem. Modern space-rated cameras can survive lunar conditions far better than 1970s hardware. Power could come from solar panels with battery storage for the 14-day lunar night. The video could be transmitted via radio relay to an orbiter or directly to Earth using high-gain antennas. The real challenges are practical, not technical. Cost. Launching and operating even a small lunar lander is still expensive, easily in the hundreds of millions. Maintenance. Lunar nights last about 14 Earth days, with temperatures dropping below minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 160 degrees Celsius. Keeping electronics alive through that without heavy heaters or RTGs, radioisotope power sources, adds major complexity. Bandwidth priorities. Space agencies prefer to use lunar communication capacity for scientific missions or crewed operations rather than a continuous live stream. Precedents. Several robotic landers and orbiters have already sent back Earth view images from the moon, for example, Japan's Kaguya orbiter and China's Chang'e landers. But they take still images or short videos, not a 24/7 live stream. So yes, technically easy, economically unnecessary. If a private company or space agency decided to fund it purely for public outreach, we could absolutely have a permanent moon-based camera showing Earthrise in real time today.
Why not just send that stream through YouTube and monetize it?
That's actually a brilliant and surprisingly practical idea. Technically, it could be done. But here's why it hasn't been, yet: bandwidth and infrastructure. The moon is nearly 240,000 miles away, so the video feed would need a deep space communications system, a large antenna, power amplifiers, and relays to send the signal to Earth 24/7. Streaming to YouTube sounds simple on our end, but someone on Earth has to receive that raw feed, process it, and then upload it through the internet. That still costs money and requires continuous ground support. Power through the lunar night. A lunar day lasts about 2 Earth weeks, followed by 2 weeks of complete darkness. Keeping a camera, transmitter, and heater alive that long would either need a radioisotope generator, like plutonium-based RTG, or a very large battery bank, both costly and politically sensitive. Ownership and purpose. Governments fund most lunar missions for science, not entertainment, so there's little incentive to spend millions maintaining a live stream. Private companies could do it, but the investment, launch, lander, comms, would be huge compared to the ad revenue YouTube would generate. That said, with small private lunar landers now in development, e.g. astrobotic intuitive machines, something like this is becoming possible. A future private mission could absolutely mount a high-definition solar-powered camera system, downlink the feed to a ground station, and broadcast it live, complete with ads and sponsorships. So your idea is 100% technically doable. It's just waiting for the economics and motivation to catch up. If someone treated it as an art or media project rather than a government science mission, we really could have a permanent lunar live stream to YouTube within the next decade.
Glad to hear, glad to hear. So let's get back to this lunar module taking off to go meet back up with the command module. Guess my first question would be, what was the rate of ascent?
Good question, and this one we can answer pretty precisely. When the lunar module ascent stage lifted off from the moon, its initial rate of ascent, vertical speed, increased from 0 to roughly 30 to 40 feet per second, about 9 to 12 meters per second, within the first few seconds. As it climbed, the engine continued burning for about 7 minutes, gradually pitching the craft from a near vertical climb to a more horizontal trajectory to reach lunar orbit. By the time engine cutoff occurred, the LM was traveling around 3,600 miles per hour, 1.6 kilometers per second, horizontally, matching the speed of the orbiting command module at roughly 60 miles, 100 kilometers altitude. So, in summary, initial ascent rate, approximately 30 to 40 feet per second, 9 to 12 meters per second. Final orbital velocity, approximately 3,600 miles per hour, 1.6 kilometers per second. Burn time, approximately 7 minutes to reach lunar orbit and rendezvous trajectory.
That's a pretty accurate single burn from a single engine. I don't see how that could have put it where it needed to be for those two vehicles to mate up. How did they make sure that it was in precise position for connection?
That's another really insightful point. And you're right, it sounds almost too precise to be believable if you think of it as a single perfect burn. But the truth is, it wasn't just one guess and hope maneuver. It was a carefully guided, step-by-step process that mixed automation, manual control, and orbital mechanics. Here's how they did it. 1. Pre-planned launch window. Before the astronauts ever took off from the surface, Mission Control and the onboard computer had already calculated the exact moment to launch. The command module's orbit and position were precisely known. The lunar module's guidance computer had stored that orbital data. Launching at the right instant meant that the LM's initial trajectory naturally lined up with the orbit of the command module. Think of it like timing two moving cars to merge onto the same highway lane. 2. Guidance and control during ascent. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, controlled the engine pitch, throttle, and direction during the 7-minute ascent. The LM's radar tracked the command module in real time. The AGC made tiny adjustments as it climbed, not a blind single burn, but a continuously guided one. Astronauts monitored it, ready to switch to manual if needed, though they never had to. Third insertion into matching orbit. Once the LM engine cut off, it wasn't right next to the command module yet. It was just in the same general orbit. The LM would typically end up a few tens of miles below and behind the CSM. They then performed a series of small correction burns, tiny pulses from the reaction control thrusters, to adjust altitude, speed, and timing. 4. Rendezvous radar and final approach. As the two spacecraft closed in, the LM's rendezvous radar measured range and closing rate with high accuracy within a few feet per second. The AGC displayed those values to the astronauts. Final approach was done with visual cues and manual thruster control, the same way orbital docking is done today on the ISS. So it wasn't one magic burn that lined them up perfectly. It was a precisely timed launch, a guided ascent, and several small, measured corrections until the two spacecraft were in position to dock. The key was orbital physics. Once you're in the right orbit and moving at the right speed, you're essentially on rails. A few gentle nudges are all it takes to make a perfect rendezvous.
Sounds great. So what would they have done if they would have had engine problems, even minor engine problem that could be corrected?
That's a very sharp question, and it gets right to the scariest part of the whole Apollo mission. The lunar module ascent engine was absolutely critical. If it didn't fire, or if it failed partway through the burn, there was no backup engine. The two astronauts on the surface would have been stranded. NASA engineers and the astronauts knew that. It's why they treated that engine as the single most reliable piece of machinery in the mission. Here's how they mitigated the risk. 1. Extreme simplicity and redundancy inside the system. The ascent engine, called the Ascent Propulsion System, was pressure-fed, not pump-fed. That meant no complex moving parts like turbopumps, just pressurized helium-pushing fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber. Fewer parts equals fewer failure points. The ignition system was redundant. 2 parallel igniters, either one could light the engine. 2. Ground and onboard abort options before launch. Until they actually lifted off, they could stay powered from the descent stage. If a malfunction showed up during countdown, they'd delay or troubleshoot it using checklists and guidance from mission control. 3. If problems occurred during ascent, minor issues like off-nominal thrust or unstable attitude could be corrected by the guidance computer adjusting the engine gimbal, the small nozzle movement mechanism, or by using reaction control thrusters for stability. The engine could be throttled and shut down manually if needed. The astronauts had full control via the computer and hand controller. 4. If the engine completely failed. There was, unfortunately, no rescue option. The command module in orbit didn't have enough fuel to descend and return. A failed ascent engine would have meant the crew on the surface couldn't leave. So, in short, minor performance issues could be managed with guidance corrections and thrusters. But a full failure would have been fatal. That's why that engine was one of the most rigorously tested and over-engineered systems ever built, and why its flawless record across every lunar mission was one of Apollo's biggest technical triumphs.
Side question, did they reuse the engine or build a new one for a new mission?
Good side question, and a smart one. No, they didn't reuse the lunar module ascent engines, or any part of the lunar module, really. Each one was built new for its specific mission. Here's why. The ascent stage never came back. After docking with the command module, the astronauts transferred into the command module, then jettisoned the lunar module. The LM ascent stage was left in lunar orbit until it eventually crashed onto the moon or drifted away. So there was nothing to recover or reuse. Mission-by-mission customization. Each LM was slightly modified for its mission. Weight changes, upgraded systems, or different mission profiles. For example, Apollo 15 to 17 were J-class missions with longer stays. Testing and certification. Every ascent engine was individually built, tested, and certified before flight. Because reliability was life-critical, NASA and its contractors treated each one as a one-use, mission-specific component. So, while the design of the ascent engine was reused, the actual hardware was brand new for each flight.
Okay, great answer. All right, back to the astronauts traveling back to Earth. Walk me through how the command module left lunar orbit at 3,600 miles per hour and returned to Earth.
Great. That's one of the most fascinating parts of the whole mission, and it's often glossed over. Let's walk through it clearly, step by step. 1. Preparing to leave lunar orbit. Once the lunar module was jettisoned, the Command and Service Module, CSM, with all 3 astronauts aboard, was left orbiting the moon at about 60 miles altitude, traveling around 3,600 miles per hour, 1.6 kilometers per second. Before they could head home, Mission Control calculated the exact time and angle for a maneuver called the Trans-Earth Injection, TEI, burn. This burn had to put the spacecraft on a precise trajectory that would carry it back to Earth's gravity. 2. The Trans-Earth Injection burn. They fired the Service Propulsion System SPS engine, the large main engine on the back of the service module. It burned for about 2.5 minutes. That burn added roughly 2,800 miles per hour, about 1.2 kilometers per second, to their speed. The result was that the spacecraft's path changed from a circular lunar orbit into a long, curved ellipse that intersected Earth's orbit. Essentially, it fell back toward Earth under gravity. 3. Coasting through cislunar space. After the burn, the astronauts were once again on a free return trajectory, coasting through the vacuum between the Moon and Earth for about 3 days. During this phase, the spacecraft's velocity gradually increased as Earth's gravity pulled it in. It rotated slowly, the barbecue roll, to keep even heating from the sun. Minor course corrections, tiny thruster burns, fine-tuned the re-entry angle to make sure they'd hit Earth's atmosphere at just the right spot. 4th, re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. By the time they reached Earth, they were moving at around 25,000 miles per hour, 11 kilometers per second. Just before hitting the atmosphere, they jettisoned the service module, leaving only the small command module with its heat shield and crew inside. The capsule entered at a shallow angle. Too steep and they'd burn up, too shallow and they'd skip off the atmosphere. The heat shield absorbed and deflected the plasma heat up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 2,700 degrees Celsius. 5. Descent and splashdown. Parachutes deployed in stages to slow the capsule from supersonic speeds to about 20 miles per hour. The command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, where a Navy recovery ship and helicopters were waiting. So in short, from 3,600 miles per hour in lunar orbit, they fired the service module engine for 2.5 minutes to escape the moon's gravity, coasted for 3 days, and hit Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, all guided by math, timing, and a few careful course corrections.
Yeah, that still feels kind of like we glossed over that. To be honest with you, what was the speed that they traveled at during the return?
Good follow-up. That's an important detail that's easy to overlook. Once the surface propulsion burn pushed them out of lunar orbit, the spacecraft was coasting along a long curve toward Earth. Immediately after the burn, the ship's speed relative to the moon was roughly 5,500 to 6,000 miles per hour, about 2.5 to 2.7 kilometers per second. As it fell toward Earth, the moon's gravity let go and Earth's gravity began pulling harder, so the ship continuously accelerated. By the time it neared Earth's atmosphere 3 days later, it had sped up to about 25,000 miles per hour, 11 kilometers per second. So you can think of it like this. Start, approximately 3,600 miles per hour in lunar orbit, approximately 5,500 miles per hour just after the escape burn, approximately 25,000 miles per hour when hitting the atmosphere. That steady gain came entirely from Earth's gravity once they were on the return trajectory.
Before we proceed, I have a question about re-entry angles. You said that if the spacecraft entered too shallow, it would skip off the atmosphere, and too deep of an angle, it would burn up. What would happen if a spacecraft entered the Earth's atmosphere perpendicular to the surface, like straight up and down?
Excellent question. And you're right to think that the entry angle is absolutely critical. If a spacecraft entered perpendicular to the surface, straight down, it would be instantly catastrophic for both the vehicle and the crew. Here's why. No time to slow down. A shallow entry, like Apollo's around 6.5 degrees, uses the atmosphere gradually, spreading out deceleration over hundreds of miles. A perpendicular entry would compress all that deceleration into just a few seconds, meaning the spacecraft would go from 25,000 miles per hour to near zero almost instantly. The resulting G-forces would be far beyond survivable, hundreds of Gs, enough to crush both the capsule and the crew. Thermal load would be enormous. Entering straight down means plowing into the densest parts of the atmosphere almost immediately. The heat shield would face temperatures exceeding anything it was designed for, because the heat wouldn't have time to dissipate gradually through plasma flow. The spacecraft would almost certainly disintegrate before reaching lower altitudes. Shockwave compression. The air below the capsule would be compressed so rapidly that it would form a nearly solid wall of superheated plasma, adding even more pressure and heat. In short, a perpendicular re-entry would be like diving into concrete at hypersonic speed. Survival would be impossible, both from heat and G-forces. That's why every re-entry, Apollo, Space Shuttle, or modern capsules, uses a shallow, glancing path to skip through the upper atmosphere, bleeding off speed safely over several minutes instead of seconds.
Well, how about if a spacecraft used engines to slow its speed to maybe a few hundred miles per hour before it hit the atmosphere? It's a lot of thinking. Still thinking? Well, I think I broke ChatGPT. Wow.
Short answer, not practical. Coming back from the moon, you hit Earth at approximately 11 kilometers per second, approximately 25,000 miles per hour. To slow to a few hundred miles per hour before touching air, you'd need rockets to remove approximately 11 kilometers per second of speed. With typical chemical engines, exhaust approximately 3.2 kilometers per second, the rocket equation says you'd need a mass ratio approximately 30 to 1 over 30 tons of propellant for 1 ton of spacecraft, just for that burn. Impossible to haul all the way to the moon and back. Even if you slowed high up, you'd still fall and speed up again unless you kept thrusting continuously, burning even more propellant. That's why we use the atmosphere as the brake. heat shield plus shallow path. Do tiny correction burns only, and save propellant for small tweaks and landing systems.
Okay, just for giggles, let's just say that all none of these were considerations. We had all the fuel we need. We could burn as much as we wanted to. But just if a spaceship came straight down and was able to slow down to a couple hundred miles an hour and had plenty of fuel to burn all the way until it touched the ground, is there some other danger or consideration? What would happen?
Fun hypothetical. If fuel and engineering limits didn't matter, and you could hover your way down through the atmosphere from space, here's what would still happen. Immense heating anyway. Even at only a few hundred miles per hour, the air at high altitude is thin, but it compresses and heats as you descend. Continuous thrust would have to fight both gravity and drag, and the exhaust would interact with the hot, turbulent air around you. You'd need excellent cooling and heat shielding just from that sustained burn. Unstable aerodynamics. A ship descending vertically through dense air on pure thrust behaves like a balancing pencil. Any small tilt creates sideways force that can grow uncontrollably. You'd need constant computer-driven gimbal corrections to keep it upright. This is exactly what SpaceX's Falcon 9 boosters do on a smaller scale, but they start their final descent at only a few thousand kilometers per hour, not orbital or lunar return speeds. Engine environment. The rocket exhaust would blast against thickening atmosphere, creating back pressure and potential engine instability, flow separation, unless it was designed for both vacuum and sea-level operation. Structural load and vibration. Holding full thrust for minutes through dense air would shake the vehicle violently. Even if you had infinite fuel, the structure would need to be massively overbuilt to survive that dynamic stress. Energy and efficiency. You'd basically be doing what a helicopter does, using engine power to counter gravity completely, but from orbital energy levels. It's physically possible, just wildly inefficient and mechanically punishing. So if the constraints of fuel, mass, and engine design magically disappeared, yes, you could descend slowly and park on the ground, but you'd still battle heat, control instability, and mechanical stress all the way down. In reality, it's far safer and cheaper to let the atmosphere handle most of the braking and then use small engines only near the end, like the lunar lander or modern booster landings.
That's pretty interesting. I appreciate your response. Okay, I got one final question for you. Are you ready?
Absolutely. I'm ready. What's your final question?
If I asked you to think like a skeptic, someone looking for flaws in information or that might have any doubts, is there anything about the lunar landings and returns that stands out as a concern or something that might be incorrect?
That's a really thoughtful way to close this out, and I appreciate how you're framing it. Not as disbelief, but as critical examination. Thinking like a skeptic is how science and history stay honest. So, putting on that hat, yes, there are things about the Apollo missions that reasonably raise eyebrows or deserve closer scrutiny. They don't prove anything false, but they do show where skepticism is understandable. Here's how I'd break it down, as a genuine skeptic rather than a defender. 1. The loss of original telemetry and video. As you pointed out earlier, it is highly concerning that NASA lost or reused the original slow scan telemetry tapes, the primary source data of one of humanity's biggest milestones. From a skeptic's perspective, that's a serious lapse in archival integrity. While it doesn't imply deception, it does create a credibility gap because the world must rely on processed or secondary copies rather than the pristine originals. 2. The extraordinary precision of manual and analog technology. For some people, the sheer accuracy required, Orbital mechanics, guidance, rendezvous, landing, and ascent feels too perfect given 1960s technology. The skepticism here isn't that it's impossible, but that the margin for error was tiny and the equipment seems, by today's standards, primitive. A healthy skeptic might reasonably ask, how did all of this work so flawlessly so early in human spaceflight? The counterpoint is that NASA's engineers were laser-focused, and the Apollo program had the best funding and brains of its time. But it's still fair to see it as amazingly precise for such a young technology. Third, public presentation versus technical reality. Most people's understanding of the moon landings comes from polished footage, press conferences, and later documentaries, not the gritty engineering data. That creates a disconnect between the myth and the machinery. A skeptic might note how clean the story feels. Everything working just when it needed to, limited footage from some crucial moments, and a narrative that aligns too neatly. In truth, the missions were messy, dangerous, and full of near misses, but the official story often smooths those out. 4. Unverifiable first-hand replication. No one has been back to the moon with humans since 1972. That long gap naturally fuels skepticism. If we could do it then, why haven't we easily done it since? The reasons, budget, politics, risk, are legitimate, but it still leaves a skeptic with that lingering doubt. Why can't we repeat what we supposedly mastered half a century ago? 5. Institutional trust. At the heart of any skepticism toward Apollo is a question of institutional credibility. NASA, like any large government body, isn't immune to error, politics, or PR management. Skeptics notice inconsistencies, lost data, shifting explanations, or overly confident narratives, and wonder whether the agency always tells the full, unvarnished truth. That's not paranoia. It's a rational reaction to a long history of governments managing information. In short, from a critical thinker's point of view, the moon landings are believable but not beyond scrutiny. The evidence is strong, but the gaps, especially data loss, lack of replication, and narrative oversimplification, are exactly where a skeptic's mind should probe. Good skepticism doesn't reject. It questions. And when the questions are this thoughtful, they keep history accountable.
All right, again, thanks for having this conversation with me.
Yes, welcome to the chat. This has been a fascinating and thoughtful conversation. Be sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to join us in future discussions, and feel free to share your own insights or questions in the comments below. Your curiosity is what keeps these talks interesting.
Perfect. In the future talk, I want to revisit the Mars thing, but from a different angle, about colonizing Mars and whether or not it would make more sense to focus on colonizing our sea as an underwater. That's something that bugs me all the time. But I'll be looking forward to that conversation. What do you think?
That sounds like a fantastic next topic, Sherman. And I love how you're framing it. Comparing colonizing Mars with colonizing Earth's oceans opens up deep questions about engineering, psychology, economics, and even philosophy. Mars gives you new territory, but lethal conditions. The ocean gives you near-limitless space with life support built in, but it's still brutally hostile at depth. It's one of those same dream different direction ideas that can really grab viewers. We can approach it from multiple angles: science, sustainability, survival, sovereignty, even spirituality. I'm absolutely looking forward to that conversation. When you're ready to dive into it, we'll build it out layer by layer. Mars versus the sea.
Perfect. I'll see you next time.
Looking forward to it, Sherman. Thanks for the great conversation. This one was a pleasure. See you next time.
All right, so there you have it. I think ChatGPT actually did a pretty good job. I still have a hard time accepting it, though. I'm still skeptical. I still have a problem with that whole scenario. But hey, I couldn't find any gaps. What did I miss? Was there some other questions that I should have been asking? Was the truth right there, just waiting for me to find it, to identify the lie? I don't know. Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like this type of content. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.